Good to be back with you for this evening service. 2 or 3 people this morning thought that I said I married my wife when she was 13 years old. No, I didn't. No, she was 2 days over 18 when I married her. You misunderstood what I said. I said that if Jesus had brought her to me when I first started praying for her, which was 4 years before we were married, I would not have married her because she was only 13 years of age at that time. So I said, I won't marry a 13-year-old. So that clears that up. Well, I told you this would be a memorable sermon. It is. It may not be the greatest, but it is going to be memorable. Part of it will deal with husbands and wives, not all of it. And I realize some of you have lost your mate, so I understand that. But at least some of those who are still married need to hear what we have to say. God in his creation, excuse me, all of this rain has been a blessing, but it has raised my allergies up to about there. In his creation, he created all the birds that fly in the heavens. He created the buzzard. There are 2 contrasting birds that I'm going to talk about tonight and adapt the lesson to it. One is the buzzard, the other is the hummingbird. The buzzards are created of God to serve a purpose, but they have a lot of different intention in the way they live and make their existence than the hummingbird does. Buzzards fly over everything that is beautiful. They pass over it until they find an old rotting carcass in the pasture or roadkill on the road, and they go down and they souse their bill into that rotten carcass. That's a buzzard. A hummingbird is a little bird whose heart beats 1,260 times a minute, who can flap his wings at 80 times a second. He can fly, he can stand still in his flight, he can fly sideways, he can fly down, he can fly bottom side upwards. And he's a beautiful little bird who weighs about 7 ounces. But the hummingbird is different from the buzzard. He flies over God's creation, and he flies over everything that is rotting and ugly, and he finds the beautiful flowers that are along the way. And he dips down and he lights delicately on the flowers and sips the nectar in the flowers. That's the difference in a buzzard and a hummingbird. Now the question I'm asking tonight, which are you? Well, you say, I'm certainly not a buzzard. Well, let's see. I hope not either. There are characteristics of a buzzard, and we can display these characteristics in our lives, especially if you have developed the attitude of seeing everything that's bad in the world and ugly and criticizing and putting people down, then you are pretty close to being feathered like a buzzard. Now, if you have an attitude where you try to see all the good, you try to bypass and overlook the bad as much as you can, and you see all the good things in life and you partake of those, then you're a hummingbird. I want you to notice tonight, speaking of the wives first, you know, a man can look at his wife and he said, honey, after a few years of marriage, said, you're not as pretty as you used to be. Well, that's a buzzard attitude. Don't do it. I think most men know better than do that, but not always. The hummingbird attitude would say, honey, you're more beautiful than they were the day I married. Now, he wouldn't be lying. There are a lot of things that get more beautiful about your wife as she gets older, besides just personal, physical beauty. We all realize that as years roll on, a woman's beauty fades to some extent. A man's handsomeness disappears to a great extent. That's just part of life. But that doesn't mean that the wife doesn't get more beautiful as she gets older. And Proverbs 31 describes a beautiful woman. And yet there is not one physical attribute that I can think of that's mentioned. They're all character. She takes care of her family. Her husband is honored because of her. They speak well of her in the gate in the city. She's industrious. She gets out and does things and takes care of things. Her husband trusts in her. That's a beautiful woman. But didn't say a thing about what she looked like. So yes, men, be a hummingbird. Tell your wife she gets more beautiful to you every day that you live. You may, of course, notice that she's not as sharp as she used to be. My wife, when she was younger, had the memory of an elephant. She never forgot anything. Well, she's forgot a few things now that she's older. So have I. Sometimes she calls me honey. She called me honey for 3 years one time, and I called her on it, and she said, well, I forgot your name 3 years ago, so I just called you honey. That's not quite true, thankfully. So we're not as sharp as we grow older. We know that. Age does take some things away from us. But nobody likes to be reminded of that. I don't like for people, it would bother me a little bit, and yet it might be true. People walk up to me and I say, well, Wellen, you're not half the preacher you used to be. Well, that wouldn't exactly make my day. It might be true, but I don't need to hear it. That's kind of an old buzzard attitude. So don't pull that on me. And you haven't. You've been very gracious, and I appreciate your comments that you've made. So we find that criticizing your wife. You know, husbands and wives live together a long time. My wife and I celebrated our 60th year together. It's hard to get through 60 years of togetherness or more without, if you're not careful, being critical. You know your mate so well that you know all their virtues and you know all their faults. So it's so easy sometimes when you're cross with them or a little out with them to pronounce one of those criticisms. Well, you're as stubborn as a mule. Well, maybe so, but we don't like to hear that. There are a lot of criticisms that can be made between husband and wives that shouldn't be made. Because we all have our faults. There are some things that we could be criticized, but who wants to hear them? But that's a buzzard approach to this. When you get on the negative side and start putting down your wife, who's been your companion for 60 years, you're acting like a buzzard. I didn't say you were a buzzard, but you're acting like one. And we don't want that. I don't think the Lord wants that. Act like a hummingbird. What is that? Praise her. Encourage her. Everything in Proverbs 31 was said about this woman was good. Of course, look who wrote the book. Praise her. I've heard the saying, and I think it's true, I love dogs. Don't care too much for cats, but I love dogs. They said a dog will raise his head to be petted, but he'll curl his lip up and growl if you raise your fist at him. I don't know if that's true or not. Sounds reasonable. We're like that. We need praise. So what do you do? Well, again, a buzzard-like attitude would be to count her faults or his faults. Find all the things you can think of that are wrong. You do this and you do that and you don't do this, you don't do that. Anybody can do that, but it doesn't make a good marriage. Count their virtues. You know, I've done a little counseling as a preacher. We always have to do some. I never did like to do it too well, wasn't too good at it. But I think if I had some of it to do over, the first thing I'd have to do if a marriage couple came to me and wanted to be counseled, I'd hand each of them a piece of paper and a pencil. I'd say, okay, sit down and write all the virtues of your mate that you can think of. Now that'd make them sweat, wouldn't it? Write all the virtues down, all the good things about your wife or your husband that you can think of, that you know. Because, see, they're not in that attitude or frame of mind when they come in. They've got a basket full of faults that they want to lay before me or the counselor and tell you how bad he is, and some of them may be true. But that's all they're intent upon, is to show you how bad he or she is. And that won't make any marriage. That'll destroy any marriage. Now let's get at the husband. Well, as men, we begin to lose our hair. Baldness is something that we just can't control. I noticed over at university, some of our middle-aged men about Mark's age, they're getting a little bald spot up there. If they were Jews, they could cover that up with that little thing that goes on their head, but they're not Jews. So their little bald spot shines from behind, sitting behind them. Well, a wife could say, honey, you're losing all your hair. You're getting to be an old bald-headed man. But that'd be a buzzard-like attitude. That wouldn't be the thing to say for him. He knows he's losing his hair. It's no revelation. And it's not a good thing to say to him. Well, what can you do and act like a hummingbird? Go over there when he's sitting in a chair and reach down and kiss him on top of that head and said, honey, you look so intelligent. I'm not saying let's lie to one another, but we can say some good things that, might be a little questionable. Let's do it for encouragement. We want to encourage one another. It is said that a plumber by profession never fixes his plumbing at home. It is said that a carpenter who is a carpenter by trade never fixes up his house at home. It is said an electrician fixes everybody else's houses, but he never changes even a light bulb in his own house. And it may be true, I don't know. You say, well, he's tired, he does that all the time, he doesn't want to do that at home. Yes, but home is where his wife lives. It's where he lives. And so he needs to be the kind of person that gets busy fixing things at home for his wife when she asks him. But wives, come at him like a hummingbird. Don't come at him like a buzzard. Don't come at him and say, you never fix anything. The house is falling down around us and you won't do a thing. You go out and fix other people's plumbing and so forth, but you don't fix ours at home. Well, I got news for you. He's not going to fix anything at home after that either. Because that's a buzzard-like approach. Come at him like a hummingbird. Say, honey, I know you have to work out, and I know it's your job, and you get tired of doing it, but you're so good at it. You're so good at fixing electricity and wiring people's houses for electricity and all. And would you please change that light bulb for me? You might be surprised. He might respond in a fine way because you've acted like a hummingbird. And again, like the wife, don't see all of his faults. He has plenty of them for sure. See his virtues. He's got to be worth something. You wouldn't have married him. And I'm sure deep down he does have a lot of virtues. Now let's move on to the children. If I could live my life over, I'd be a better father. I've learned a few things after I raised my children that would sure help while I was raising them. I think I was a pretty good dad after all, but I could have been a great dad if I'd known some of these things. Children need discipline. It's amazing how little understanding some parents have about children. Children want to be disciplined. Deep down deep, they want to be disciplined. Or they don't like it. They'll act like they can't stand it when you have to show some kind of disciplinary work. And they act like they're going to die. If you ground them for a couple of weeks, that's just the world came to an end for as they're concerned, and they'll tell you about it. But they'll respect you for it if you've got a good reason for it. They need to learn what it is to suffer when you do wrong and learn to be corrected. They need these things, and they need all the help they can get. They need encouragement. Children, when they're growing up, you think about how much did you encourage your kids when you were raising them? I remember when I was a little boy, went to church at a little place, a schoolhouse, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. How many would go to church at 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon? Not many. I did. Preacher at Barrett would preach at noontime, come out 3 o'clock, preach to us, most family, about 20 of us. After it was over with, we had a basketball court out there, a dirt court, and me and my cousin, we'd go out and play basketball. And I remember one time, some man, grown man, standing off watching us, said, that Weldon is going to be a good basketball player. I heard him. I started glowing like a neon light. When I got to high school, I excelled in basketball. Got a most valuable player. 4 years, played 130 some odd games without being substituted. Just high school. But I had a good career. My coach said this later to another person. He said, Weldon Flanagan is the best basketball player I've ever coached my whole life. I appreciate that. But I tell you that, not to brag on myself, because there's nothing to brag about. But I tell you that because it happened, I think, because somebody said he's going to make a good little basketball player. I'll tell you one other thing. It is said, and I don't remember this, that when I was a little boy, a little kid, they called me the little preacher. When I grew up and become sort of an adult, guess what was on the bottom of my list to do? Preaching. I never wanted, nor intended, nor ever entertained the idea of being a preacher. Did they, calling me a little preacher, have any influence on my life? I don't know. But here I am, doing the very thing that I thought I never would do, and enjoy it. Those are things to think about. In raising children, it's easy to tell them they cannot do anything. It's easy to rebuke them all the time. Don't do this. Don't do that. Stop making some racket. Don't you do that, you're going to break it. Watch where you step. Do what your mother told you to do. Those are all negatives, and they are important. I'm not belittling them. They're things they have to learn. But where are the positive? Where's the hummingbird at? Sure, that's a good old buzzard. Well, maybe it's not a buzzard. It's something that has to be done, but it's sort of along that line. But where's the hummingbird in all of this? Where is the commendation for these children when they do something right? When they do what you tell them, say, hey, you did what I told you. That's good. You did a good job. How many times have you been told that when you were a child? I grew up in an age when children were to be seen but not heard. We were the last to eat at a dinner table if there's a crowd. Now it's reversed. The kids get to go first. There used to be a cartoon in the paper, born 30 years too soon. Well, that's me. I was born 30 years too soon. Not complaining. Show them how to do something. I've seen children raise up and become adults and didn't know how to put a light bulb in. Why not? Nobody ever taught them. Instead of saying, well, he's so dumb, he doesn't know how to do anything. Instead of saying that, show him what to do. Teach him how. Let him see you do it. Give him an example. Take the time, and that's the problem. It takes time to teach your children how to do something. Teach them how to run the vacuum cleaner. Teach them how to work on it if you have to. My youngest daughter, I didn't know this, she used to watch me when I'd work on a car. Back in those days, you could work on an automobile motor. You can't today. You have to be a genius to work on it today. But I'd work on a carburetor or the spark plugs or whatever, and she watched me, and she knows quite a bit about cars, and she says she does. Said, I learned it from watching my daddy. I didn't even know it. See, I looked out by being dumb. But that's not the best way to do it. Show them how to do something and expect them to do it and do it right. Sometimes parents say, oh, children are so much trouble. And they are. It takes a lot of work to raise a child. Just so much trouble. But what would life be without them? After they get grown and they excel, what do? We brag on them. That's my son. That's my daughter. And if you've taught them, you have a right to do that. If you didn't teach them, you keep your mouth shut. You didn't help much. Well, those are things about family. Now let's go over to the church. Are there, excuse me, are there any buzzards in the church? Probably so. I see one holding his hand up back there. Thank you. One honest man in the whole congregation. I suppose in all of us, we got a few black feathers growing on us. Need to kind of get them off. But we hope we become hummingbirds as we grow and mature. In Ephesians 5:25, Christ loved the church so much he gave himself for it. He also told us to love our husbands as our wives. Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Church must be important. It must be somebody that God really appreciates. Jesus died on the cross to purchase it. He worked all of his life, what life he lived, to establish it or bring the establishment about it, the kingdom. In Revelation, it's called the bride of Christ. The Lamb's wife is the bride. John the Baptist in John 3:29 said, "Behold the groom who has the bride." The bridegroom has the bride. So I'm only the friend of the bridegroom. So the church is important. But you know, I hear and notice people, there's some people that look upon the church as being too restrictive. Holds us down. Tells us what's wrong with us sometimes. And they get a viewpoint, I guess, the church is kind of a bad taste in their mouth when they think of the church. And some people criticize the church. I don't know what's wrong with that church up there. I don't know what's wrong with the elders. That preacher's not what I like. And he may not, which is legitimate. But all they do is criticize the church and never say anything good about it. Well, you know what that's like. That's kind of a buzzard-like attitude. And it's not good for the church, and it's not good for that person. If the church is the Lord's bride, and it is, then how many times have you ever gone to a wedding and sit there and hear people mumbling and grumbling about the bride? Look at that girl. She's not a very good bride. She's not very pretty. Why don't you wear that dress? You hear that kind of things when you go to a wedding? No. Why? Everybody's on the good behavior. They know it's a joyous day for the couple. They want all the best things that can be said and done for that couple that day. So they don't criticize the bride nor the groom. Now, when you criticize the church, you're criticizing Christ's bride. And I don't think he'd appreciate that. It's a buzzard-like attitude. We don't want to do that. Some people don't like to go to church. They feel like they've been made to go to church all their life, and they don't want to go yet. Well, I feel, and I'm sorry for those people, but they need to change their attitude around and start thinking like a hummingbird and start looking at everything as good and wholesome and something to look forward to. My body doesn't want to go to church on Sunday. Sunday morning comes, my body says, "Oh, do we have to get up?" My spirit says, "Yep, we're going to worship the Lord today." My body says, "Well, okay." So my body comes up here, it sits on a pew, it squirms a little bit. Think the sermon's too long. My body now thinks that. But my spirit's rejoicing. It's singing and worshiping God and having a great day. That's what it's all about. Your body's always going to be opposed to you. That's why Jesus said, "Crucify the flesh and the affections and the lust thereof." Why? That old body will drag you down if you let it control you. You're not going to ever like to sit in a church building. There's never going to be a pew soft enough and comfortable enough for you. My wife goes to church some places, I feel like a little kid. My feet won't touch the floor. Little kid dangling her legs and said it's uncomfortable. Well, I bet it is. So we need to learn to enjoy life and think well of the church and love the church because Christ loves it. And after all, you are the church, so I love you and you love me, so what's so bad about the church? I think there's some great Christians in the church. There are some that go so far as to be a buzzard and cause trouble in the church. I hate this, to see a person that can try to split a church or cause problems or through innuendos to try to get some bad things said about people that causes harm. But a hummingbird supports the church. A hummingbird works for the Lord. A hummingbird builds up the church. We're told to edify one another. We're working in a vineyard. And we're singing our way to heaven. Last of all, not least, is how do you act toward God? A lady moved in next door to us not long ago. Went over to visit with her. She's out in the yard. We wanted to visit with her and get acquainted, welcome her to our neighborhood. She immediately began to tell me that God had taken her husband. She was very vengeful. God has taken my husband away and made life miserable for me. I tried in the gentlest way I knew how to try to encourage her and say, God did not take your husband. He may have died, but God didn't take him. Yes, he did. He took him. He wasn't that old. I said, but he still didn't take him. Didn't change her mind. She stayed less than a year, miserable all the time she was there, left and moved away, I don't know where. The house is still vacant. I don't know if it's hers or went back to the loan company or whose. And I guarantee you, wherever she is, she has not changed. She's still as miserable as she was the day she left. Why? She blamed God for something that God does not do or did not do. I'm not saying that God does not receive us when we die. Don't misunderstand me. He sends the angels, he did to Lazarus, and takes us back to the place we're supposed to be when we die. But that's not taking our lives. That's not God saying, okay, Mark, it's time for you to die. So you got to die. That's not what God does. He has taken people upon occasion, a very few. Enoch was taken. Elijah was taken up. But these were special circumstances. In everyday life, God does not take people. He receives them. He says, though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he says, I am with you. So he never deserts us. He's always with us, but he does not take our lives. So let's don't blame him for that. Some of them see God as wanting to send people to hell. All he made people for is to send to hell. They make it sound like God does not even want anybody to go to heaven. Then what is he making it for? I believe we'll be honest about that. God would love for every person that's ever been born to go to heaven. And he cared so much that he gave up his own son from his heavenly comfort to come down here and die a miserable death so that we could be saved. Everybody could be saved. And the gospel is for all. Salvation is for all. That's what he did. And now are we going to point a finger at God and say that God doesn't care for people? That God wants people to go to hell? I don't think so. Yes, he has created a hell for people to disobey him, but that's part of the justice system. God is a just God. Evil has to be punished. So it's something that's consistent with God. Some say his word is too hard. I can't understand it, so I'm not even going to try. Well, Scripture tells us, God tells us, study and show yourself approved. A workman need not be ashamed of himself. Put a little effort into it. I didn't understand the Bible at one time either. Now I understand it so much better. I can sit down in an hour and a half. I can take you through the whole Bible in an hour and a half and give you a pretty good understanding of what God's trying to do. I couldn't do that a long time ago at all. Others can do that. Some people go through life like a buzzard, feeling cheated, Feel like nothing good ever happens to me. Nobody likes me. You know, I've seen people even in the church who, when you meet them in a hallway, will not speak to you unless you speak first. You say, hello, so-and-so, they say, oh, hi. If you don't say anything, they'll walk right by you and never say a word. Every one of those people, I believe, are miserable. And I believe there's one thing, little thing, just one little thing that changed their whole life if they do it. God in His Word says, he that would have friends must present himself friendly. He that would have friends must present himself friendly. If each of those people would speak to me first when they meet me, it would change their lives. They wouldn't be the same people after a while. They'd stop being so negative and down on everything and start being a little bit more cheery. They'd find out that life's pretty good. Why? Because they're putting out a little effort. They're trying to finally do something that God's told everybody to do. And that's the way of every command of the Lord. When you do what the Lord tells you to do, you're going to reap blessings from it. He didn't give these commands in the world to make us miserable. He gave them to improve our lives and to make life joyful and serviceable to the Lord. Thank God for the teachings and the rules and regulations, we call them, and commandments in the Scripture, because they guide me into the paths of righteousness, and they show me how to live and how to become somebody that I can respect. After all, I have to love my neighbor as I love myself. And you can't love your neighbor very well if you don't like yourself. Well, friends, I conclude by saying I still didn't marry that girl when she was 13 years old. I've appreciated preaching to you today and tonight. I hope I've said something that enlightened your way or made you feel better about yourself. Makes you enjoy being a Christian more than you did before you came. Maybe helped your attitude a little bit. Maybe you're more of a hummingbird now. And if you are, you're a beautiful creature. You're one of the most beautiful birds in the world and the most harmless bird I know of. So let's all be hummingbirds tomorrow. Well, let's be hummingbirds tonight before we go to bed. Most of you are, I know. But I hope it encourages you, and God bless you if you've got a hummingbird attitude, because the world needs that more today than anything I know of. So if we can help you tonight, become a Christian, or if you need prayers, most of you are Christians, so you don't need to tell you everything to do. But if we can help you in any way, while we stand and sing, will you come?